President Trump's signature economic policy is taking center stage at the Supreme Court today.
The future of his tariffs hangs in the balance. Justices heard oral arguments on the case today. At issue is a legal question around the limits of executive power.
America is once again on the brink. And at this time, everything is being decided not at rallies or in the White House, but in the Supreme Court building. It is here today that an issue is being discussed that could turn the U.S. economy upside down, undermine global markets, and change the perception of presidential power. We're talking about Donald Trump's tariffs, the very ones that were supposed to save American industry, but now may become the cause of his administration's biggest political defeat. Conservative judges appointed by Trump himself unexpectedly turned against him. The questions were not just harsh, they conveyed doubt, irritation, and perhaps fear that the president had gone too far. When Amy Coney Barrett, one of the most loyal figures to Trump on the court, asked Spain, France, "Do you really believe that these countries threaten our national security?" And the courtroom fell silent.
What this case was about is whether or not there was actually an emergency, and who gets to decide? Is it the president? Is there oversight to that? Can the courts come in and question it? Can the legislature come in and question it?
Even the White House representatives look confused. What is happening now is not just a dispute over import taxes. It is a direct test of the limits of presidential power in America. Trump claims that he acted within the framework of a 1977 law that gives the president the right to impose economic measures in the event of an emergency. But his opponents say there was no emergency. There was no war, no sanctions, no sudden threat. There was only political calculation and a desire to use the economy as a weapon. The stakes are huge. If the Supreme Court decides that Trump's actions were illegal, the government will have to return billions of dollars collected from businesses and consumers.
Yeah, this is one of those funny situations where you have Wall Street traders going on Oyez or going on SCOTUSblog.com to figure out what happens here, because
economists are already warning that this could cause a domino effect. Lawsuits, a loss of confidence in the markets, and rising prices. If, on the contrary, the court supports Trump, it will effectively legalize the right of any president to declare an economic emergency at his discretion. This would change the very structure of power in the U.S., giving the head of state almost unlimited powers in trade and finance. Trump is confident that he is doing the right thing. In an interview with Fox News, he called the case one of the most important in the history of the country and warned that defeat would be a disaster for America. But within Washington, there are increasing signs of panic. The Departments of Finance, Trade, and Foreign Affairs are already preparing a Plan B in case of defeat, although no one knows exactly what it should be. While lawyers argue over the interpretation of the law, analysts are talking about something else. This story is not about tariffs, but about power. It's about who in America today decides where security ends and the economy begins. The Supreme Court, which has a conservative majority, has found itself acting as an arbiter between the president, the markets, and the Constitution. And its decision will determine not only how much we pay for imported goods, but also how strong American democracy itself is. Today's hearings are not just a legal procedure. This is a moment of truth for a country that has always prided itself on its system of checks and balances. But if the court supports Trump, the balance between the branches of government may never return to its previous state.
in the Supreme Court today, but a lot of them are. But again, those are costs that businesses have been grappling with. In many cases, they've been choosing it to take it on the chin. In other cases, they've been passing those costs on to customers. But that's what hangs in the balance of this Supreme Court decision.
In February of this year, dozens of television cameras, hundreds of journalists and protesters with "Stop the Tariff War" signs lined up outside the U.S. Supreme Court building. It would seem to be just another hearing, one of many, but for Washington, for all American businesses, and even for U.S. allies abroad, this day was special. The court had to consider whether Donald Trump had exceeded his authority by imposing large-scale tariffs against dozens of countries under the pretext of a national emergency. And what began as a tool of economic pressure has turned into a legal storm that now threatens to sweep away the very logic of presidential power. Many experts call this process the biggest test for the Supreme Court since the 2000 election case, when the fate of the country was decided in a matter of days. The history of these tariffs did not begin yesterday. From the very first day of his presidency, Trump built his rhetoric around the idea of America first. He spoke of unfair trade agreements, of other countries robbing the U.S. for years by using cheap labor and manipulating currencies. His promise to bring back jobs.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Became the main slogan of his campaign, and tariffs were the tool to achieve this. First came tariffs on steel and aluminum from China. then on goods from Mexico and Canada, followed by a wave of tariffs against the European Union. All of this was presented as a fight for national security. In reality, as even those inside the White House noted, tariffs became less of an economic weapon and more of a political one. They allowed pressure to be exerted on other countries in negotiations, created the appearance of decisive action, and reinforced Trump's image as a man who was not afraid to take risks. But the consequences turned out to be more complicated. Small businesses, especially in rural areas, began to lose profits. Prices for imported materials and equipment rose, and farmers, traditional Republican supporters, faced a decline in export sales. In some states, factories that depended on supplies from abroad were closing. And although the White House assured that the tariffs would pay for themselves, the economy gradually lost momentum. Lawyers who filed lawsuits against the administration argued that the president had exceeded his authority. According to the 1977 law that Trump cited, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the head of state can only impose economic measures in the event of an emergency threat to national security.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions.
This law was usually applied against terrorist, military regimes, and rogue countries. But Trump went further. He declared an economic emergency because of the trade deficit. In other words, because America buys more than it sells. According to him, this was an unstable and deadly situation. Even for lawyers accustomed to bold interpretations, such an argument sounded dubious. Nevertheless, the White House was already preparing for legal battles. One of the leaks, published in July, referred to an internal memo in which Trump's advisors directly acknowledged that the legal basis was on the verge of being acceptable. But politically, this move was considered justified. Trump wanted to show that he was capable of managing the economy like a corporation, quickly, without bureaucracy or coordination. He was proud that his decisions shocked Washington, and this was one of the sources of his popularity among his supporters. However, as tariff pressure grew, cracks began to appear. In 2024, the total amount of payments from American companies in the form of additional duties exceeded $200 billion. Some large corporations began to move production abroad to circumvent tariffs, and consumers within the country felt the rise in prices. Studies emerged showing that each American family was overpaying an average of $800 per year due to the tariff policy.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
For politicians preparing for elections, these figures were a wake-up call. At this point, the states entered the fray. A coalition of 14 regions filed a class action lawsuit claiming that the White House had violated the principles of federalism by acting without consultation and damaging the local economy. In one statement, the governor of a Midwestern state known for its auto industry said, "The president cannot declare war on the whole world under the guise of an emergency." This lawsuit became the starting point for the current proceedings. When the case reached the Supreme Court, political circles said that the outcome was a foregone conclusion. And after all, the majority of the judges are conservatives, 6-3, and half of them were appointed by Trump himself. But things turned out differently. In the first minutes of the hearing, it became clear that even loyal judges were not ready to unconditionally accept the White House's position. Amy Coney Barrett asked a question that immediately went viral on social media. Spain, France. Do you really consider them a threat to our defense? The courtroom laughed, but it was a nervous laugh.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
This question not only cast doubt on the administration's arguments, it undermined the very logic of the tariff war. According to witnesses who attended the hearing, White House representatives looked tense. One of the lawyers even got confused in his answers, talking about possible threats through financial channels. The judges continued to press. One of them asked, if the president can declare a state of emergency because of a trade deficit, why not because of oil prices? Or because Americans are buying too many phones from Asia? And these remarks sounded like mockery, but in a legal context, they had serious meaning. The judges wanted to understand where the law ends and arbitrariness begins. For Trump, this hearing was a moment of truth. He personally monitored the proceedings, and after the hearing told Fox News that the day went great, but as journalists noted, his voice sounded uncertain for the first time in a long time. There were whispers in the corridors of power that the White House was already discussing a defeat scenario. The Treasury Department is preparing a possible mechanism for returning funds to companies, although this is publicly denied. There is growing concern within the administration if the court decides that the president has broken the law. The consequences will be enormous. Against the backdrop of this drama, analysts recall how tariff policy once seemed a symbol of strength in 2018, 2019.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Trump confidently said that tariffs would bring billions into the Treasury and force China to play by the rules. He called himself Tariff Man. But now that image is turning against him. The Supreme Court is considering not just numbers and taxes, but the question of whether the president can use emergency powers for political purposes. And if the answer is no, it will be a blow not only to Trump, but to all his successors. Paradoxically, it is the conservative judges whom Trump promoted as defenders of executive power who have now become a barrier to its expansion. This shows how profoundly American politics has changed. In an era when the boundaries between the branches of government are blurred, even the Supreme Court is becoming an arena for the struggle for the future of the presidential system. And this is only the beginning. There are long weeks of discussion, predictions, and pressure from all sides ahead, but one thing is already clear. Whatever the verdict, America will never be the same after this case. The Supreme Court hearings have become not just a legal process, but a real political drama, with unexpected twists, tense dialogues, and the feeling that what is being decided in the courtroom is not only the fate of tariffs, but the very principle of presidential power. From the very first minutes, it became clear that the conservative judges were not going to be silent observers. Their questions hit the mark, tearing the Trump administration's arguments to shreds.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Journalist Present wrote that the atmosphere resembled an interrogation, calm but relentless. When the White House representative spoke, justifying the president's right to impose tariffs without congressional approval, the judges constantly interrupted him. One of them asked directly, if the president can declare an economic emergency because of a trade deficit, does that mean he can do the same because of a stock market crash or rising gasoline prices? The lawyer's answer was incoherent. He tried to explain that the tariff situation was unique and related to threats to national stability, but at that moment, even the audience in the hall exchanged glances. Many understood that the argument sounded shaky. Amy Coney Barrett's reaction was particularly telling. Her question about Spain and France, which can hardly be called enemies of the United States, became a symbol of skepticism growing even among loyal judges. According to eyewitnesses, after this remark, several journalists in the room literally stopped typing. So unexpected was the directness of her response. This was an alarming signal for the White House. After all, Barrett was considered one of the most reliable allies of the conservative wing. However, other judges were no less harsh. One of them pointed out that the powers that the Trump administration attributes to itself are unprecedented. Even during the Cold War, presidents did not impose comprehensive tariffs under the pretext of an emergency.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
At that time, measures were taken on a case-by-case basis against specific countries or sectors. Now we are talking about dozens of countries, including NATO allies. Can a situation that the president himself created through his actions be considered a crisis? The judge asked. This question remained unanswered. According to reporters present in the courtroom, at some point, even representatives of the administration began to realize that the rhetoric about a national threat was no longer working. One of the lawyers representing small businesses presented the court with documents showing how tariffs had affected domestic supply chains. He cited examples of companies that had been forced to close after losing access to imported components. When he finished, the courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Even the judges, usually reserved, looked pensive. The legal essence of the case turned out to be much deeper than many observers had assumed. It all came down to the interpretation of one word, regulate. The 1977 law that Trump referred to does indeed allow the president to regulate trade in the event of an emergency threat. But what does that mean? Can regulate include the right to impose taxes, collect duties, and effectively change the country's economic policy?
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The administration representative argued that yes, regulation implies a wide range of actions, but state and business lawyers insisted that taxes and tariffs are the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress, and the president does not have the right to impose them on his own. This is where the real battle of arguments began. Trump's side cited precedents from the Reagan and Bush eras, arguing that presidents had repeatedly used economic measures without congressional approval when it came to protecting national interests. But opponents pointed out that those cases involved sanctions against individual countries that had violated international treaties, not a global tariff campaign against almost the entire world. One lawyer even said that such an interpretation of the law opens the door to economic absolutism. At one point, the hearing took on an almost philosophical character. The judges began to discuss where the protection of the state ends and the abuse of power begins. One of them noted that if the court supports Trump, future presidents will be able to declare a state of emergency for any reason, from migration to climate change, and use it as an excuse to bypass Congress. On the other hand, the administration's lawyers warned that if the court limits these powers, America will lose flexibility in crisis situations, and enemies will be able to take advantage of this.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Amid this intellectual battle, there were also more emotional moments. When discussing the possibility of returning billions of dollars collected through tariffs, Barrett noted that this could lead to legal chaos. A representative of the Treasury Department admitted that the refund system had not even been developed yet. This caused laughter in the courtroom. But for the White House, it was a blow. It became clear that they had entered the case without a clear plan. Outside the courtroom, the events were perceived almost like a political thriller. Financial markets were nervous. The Dow Jones index fell nearly 3% on the day of the hearing, and analysts began talking about legal uncertainty as a new risk for investors. Exporters from Asia and Europe watched the live broadcast. The outcome of the case would determine whether tariffs that set prices for billions of dollars of goods would remain in place. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate in Washington that a rift was brewing within the administration. Some advisors allegedly warned Trump back in the spring that using the IEEPA on such a scale could be disastrous. But the president, according to sources, dismissed them as alarmists. Now, these same officials are distancing themselves from the process, trying to emphasize that they did not participate in the preparation of the legal arguments. An interesting episode occurred at the end of the second day of hearings. One of the judges mentioned that the Supreme Court cannot consider economic policy in isolation from the Constitution.
L'ancien l'ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
He reminded them that the power to impose taxes and tariffs belongs to Congress, and that presidential power is limited to emergency situations. When a White House representative tried to object, saying that economic dependence on imports is an emergency threat, the judge interrupted him. Dependence is not war. The economy is not a battle. And a trade deficit is not an emergency. It is simply a reality that requires policy, not panic. These words were met with applause in the courtroom, a rare occurrence in such a formal proceeding. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that the court's decision could set a precedent for decades to come. If the judges side with Trump, the presidency will gain new, virtually unlimited tools. If they rule against him, a clear limitation will be created that will forever change the relationship between the White House and Congress. Some call it a battle for the economic constitution, others an attempt to save the balance of power. And although the final verdict is still pending, it is already clear today that the Supreme Court has become an arena where two visions of what America is have collided. One is a country where the president can act decisively and independently, defending national interests at any cost. The other is a republic where power is limited by law, and even the most charismatic leaders are required to follow procedures.